Waiting for this to connect here.
Okay.
All right. Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Posner, founder of The Mindful Advantage, and I'm here with my guest today, Srini Rao, and he's the host of the Unmistakable Creative podcast series. And this is really an incredible series, very informative, and he's also a Wall Street Journal best-selling author with his book, The Art of Being Unmistakable. So without further ado, I actually think it's best if Srini actually tells us all about the Unmistakable Creative and the mission statement and the whole idea behind it.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So the mission statement is something that seems to be in a constant state of evolution, but really, I think that, if you sum it up, it's candid conversations with insanely interesting people. And I think that, often many of the sort of media outlets and podcasts and sort of bigger brands focus almost exclusively on, hey, this person is famous, this person is super well known. But, one of the things that I think has really kind of separated our work from the pack is the fact that we don't just focus on famous or well-known people. We just bring in people who are interesting, who have fascinating stories, and they come from all walks of life. The common thread being this notion of unmistakable, that, they're making a unique contribution to the world in only the way that they could make it. And I hope in the process of telling these stories that we empower and enable, listeners of ours to be able to do the same in their own lives and in their own work. So, interestingly, I think when you give people a compass rather than a map, they end up coming up with outcomes and solutions that you couldn't have ever predicted. And so you have people like, parents who homeschool their children listening to using the content of our show. You have college professors who assign our interviews as, part of their curriculum. We have a number of, one of the most interesting ones is we have a nonprofit in Montana called the Station Foundation, where they actually use our material as part of the curriculum for training retired special forces members on how to transition into civilian careers. So I think, it's been very cool to see all of that. But I think at the core of it, more than anything, our mission really is to give people stories and insights that enable them to make their own unique contributions to the world.
Wow, it's and I can confirm that your podcasts are extremely interesting. I'm blown away almost every time I listen to them. When I listen to them, I sit down with a notepad and take detailed notes. I just listened to Jim Bunch and the other Srini Pillay in the last couple of days. Again, just unbelievable information, as I think you quite often say, just gold. So you have an economics degree from Berkeley and an MBA from Pepperdine. So something tells me that 15 years ago, 10 years ago, when you were an undergrad and getting your MBA, that you most likely weren't thinking that you would be a podcast host.
Yeah.
So A, is that correct? And B, what spurred you in this direction?
Yeah. Yes, that is absolutely correct. I thought I was going to pretty much have like a standard corporate job, which really, to sum it up, I pretty much have been fired from every job I've ever had. So that didn't really go according to plan. The thing is that there were a couple of things that sort of planted the seeds for this. The first being that I've always been a writer and a creator. The thing is that in those days, like in 2000, when I left Berkeley, and even when I was in Berkeley, the internet wasn't quite what it is today. It hadn't evolved to the point where, we had so much power in the hands of an individual creator. Like, what used to cost, like what nowadays, would take somebody a weekend sitting on their laptop in a garage to build, needed $60 million in funding. Like, you didn't have Amazon Web Services that could give you this kind of computing power. You didn't have WordPress that, enabled anybody to basically start a website with very limited sort of design knowledge. And you didn't have social media either. You didn't have the ability to connect with people the way that you do today. So, but the thing is that I think one of the sort of patterns that's worth mentioning is that I've always been somebody who tinkered with new technology. So like my roommate was the original graphic designer at Yelp, and I was one of the first 500 users at Yelp. And funny enough, one of my friends said, "Yeah, you guess you were planting seeds for your writing life early." I didn't realize that was absolutely true. I mean, part of what drew me to the platform was not necessarily reviews, but sharing my writing. And I think that I've gravitated towards platforms that enabled me to do that, which is why Medium is another place where I spend a significant amount of my time each week, not just as a reader, but also as a contributor. And then the other sort of seed that got planted was that between my first and second year of business school, I was the social media intern at Intuit in the TurboTax group. And I didn't get a job offer at the end of the summer, but I was being exposed to content creation on a daily basis, like blogs and Twitter and all of this stuff. So, my natural tendency to tinker was how I spent all my time at that job. And, even while I was in business school, I wrote for the business school blog. I started a number of blogs that failed. Didn't fail, but I just didn't know what the hell I was doing. So, and then in 2009, when I got out of business school, I remember talking to one guy named Peter Bregman. He writes for HBR Press, and he's an author and a consultant. And he told me the worst thing that you could do when you're unemployed is to spend all your time looking for a job, which, sounds like counterintuitive advice. Like, that sounds ridiculous to anybody who's unemployed, because the only thing on your mind usually is, the fact that you don't have a job. The problem with that approach, though, is that your whole life becomes consumed by this thing that is bothering you, or this thing that is a negative. Whereas, if you find something else to do, at least even if it's for an hour a day, you have something else that's positive. So, my positive thing that I did for an hour a day while searching for a day job was to start this blog called The School of Life. That subsequently was spun out into a weekly interview. What started there was an interview series called Interviews with Up and Coming Bloggers. That was subsequently spun out into a website called Blogcast FM. And then at the end of 2013, we actually decided to really kind of gut the brand, the Blogcast FM brand. We didn't lose our listeners. They were all our listeners, and people thought we were crazy. They're like, we're going to change the name of the show, and we're going to do a massive brand overhaul. Mainly because, we kind of thought, we've kind of reached the limit of what is possible with interviewing bloggers. Like, this is a very limited sort of niche. And, what we've started to find was that the interviews that were most popular had very little to do with blogging and growing blogs and stuff. It was the people who were fascinating, interesting human beings. And so I think that became sort of the sort of core idea was, we're much more interested in telling, stories about fascinating people and doing these really in-depth profiles and sort of taking you on the emotional journey of somebody's life, which, resonates in a way I think that tactical things don't, I don't, I think the term podcaster is really stupid. And I, it's funny because I always tell people I am not a podcaster, but I'm a storyteller who happens to use podcasting as one of the mediums in which I tell my stories. So, if you look at the content we create, we write books, we produced an animated series, we produced a live event, and all of that is storytelling, and it's using different forms of media to tell stories. I personally, I think I think labels limit your capacity. I mean, I think you want to get good at one thing. So, the podcast absolutely is insanely valuable. It's our foundation. We couldn't do everything else we do without it. And my commitment to mastery at that has always kind of remained. I've always wanted to keep improving as an interviewer. And I keep thinking, okay, how can we make this better? How can we make this better? And I think that, I think some people look at it as, okay, how do I get this thing to be as big as possible in the shortest time as possible? Whereas we've always been focused on the product above everything else. It's kind of like, let's make something amazing that people absolutely love, because if we do that, the growth will happen. I always say you can't hide shitty art behind great marketing. You can, but not for very long. Because you're effectively pulling a bait and switch on people. So that's kind of how we've arrived at, where we're at today. And, now there's been more than 600 conversations with people from every walk of life imaginable: bank robbers, drug dealers, performance psychologists, entrepreneurs, best-selling authors, cartoonists. I mean, you name it. We're just always on the lookout for people who are interesting, people who have done really interesting things with their lives, with their careers. There's, often we get asked, what does it take to become an unmistakable creative guest? And I'm like, well, if you could dial it down to a formula, it wouldn't be unmistakable. And that's, even though we finally put up some guidelines, we're like, this is kind of what we expect. But, it's, and we've said no to a lot of people that other people would say yes to, like famous people. And I think that shocks them. Like, yeah, we just don't think it's a fit.
Right. Interesting. So, one thing that you just said you don't want to define what unmistakable creative necessarily means, but I have seen you kind of pseudo define it at times by saying to be unmistakably creative, you are doing something so unique that there is no competition.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, for the purposes of writing a book, you absolutely have to make a definition of something like that. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, like, you can't really say this is the 6-step formula to become, there's no recipe necessarily to say, okay, this is absolutely what makes you unmistakable. If you do these 5 things, you'll become unmistakable, because that would be the antithesis of it, right? Like, because then everybody could say, okay, I'm going to go do those 5 things. And then, that becomes completely irrelevant at that point. Like you're like, okay, this is not unmistakable. This is just a copycat of everything that already exists.
And at a certain point, if everybody's doing the same thing, it doesn't work anymore anyway, because everybody's doing it, right? So by definition, very interesting. I saw one quote that you said, which really struck me, and it said, "Extracting unmistakable stories out of people is my superpower." Mm. So, and again, as a listener to your show, I would agree with you. And as somebody that's interviewing people now also, it's very difficult. And so where do you think that superpower comes from?
That's a great question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. Wow. So a couple of different places, I think. One of the strange roots of it, I think, is the fact that I moved constantly as a kid. I was always being forced into situations where, like I was the new kid, like we moved probably a dozen times before I even started high school. So, and it's not to say I was a social genius by any means. In fact, I was more of a social outcast in every situation. Like I was one of those people in school that was a total geek, even in college. And I think, Gay Hendricks made a really interesting observation when I chatted with him. He said anybody that he's seen who's achieved sort of outside success, they all have these sort of weird outsider tendencies. We're all kind of, outcasts in one way or misfits in another. Like, outcast in social settings in high school and, college, I'm kind of like, okay, I have friends, but I'm not, this popular or amazing person. And I think, what came about from that was this sort of deep desire to understand, what makes people tick and, what causes human beings to connect and to resonate with each other. Like what is underneath all the layers of a person, like beyond what we know them for, beyond what we can read about them, what really enables, all of what they do. And, what challenges have they had as a human being that I think we all have as human beings. So I think a big part of it is just this innate curiosity about people. Like I am genuinely curious about how people do what they do. Like, when you interview a guy who's a bank robber, there's no way you can't be curious about that. Not only that, the guy happens to be more well-read than I am. Like, wow, this guy read more books in 7 years in prison than I did at Berkeley. How is that possible? So, and to me, there's something powerful to learn from people like that. Here's a guy, okay, you robbed 30 banks, you read a ton of books, and now you're a talking head on the criminal justice system. This is amazing. Like,
just curious, if I could interject. Yeah. What was the genre of most of the books that he was reading in prison? Did you find out? I'm just curious.
There's a lot of philosophy and a lot of history. I don't remember in detail, to be very candid with you.
That's fine.
But yeah, I mean, it was just such a mind-blowing conversation. In fact, probably maybe we'll do a rerun of that episode now that you've you've brought it up again. But there's this there's this like I said, it's just an innate curiosity about what makes human beings not just tick. I think I really want to understand at the deepest level what makes human beings thrive. Like, how do they manage to find this sort of balance between happiness, fulfillment, and success? And how do they do it, and how does it manifest in their lives, and what enables that, and why is it that it manifests for some people, why doesn't it manifest for others? So the reality of it is, like, I think I've even said this on the show before, most of my questions are me battling with my own demons. I just happen to be able to do it with people who are far smarter than I am.
So just want to backtrack to a couple of things that you've said, which I find pretty interesting. You know, you were talking about about misfits and outcasts, and these are the types of people that are the best interviewers and so forth. And I think it's worth noting that the misfits and outcasts, I think, typically have the most interesting ideas, and they have the ideas that people say, oh, you can't do that. I mean, you look at just hey, I want to fly an airplane, or you know, I want to start sending packages across country overnight, and these are the people that figure out how to do it after tons of people say this can't be done and you're crazy. Right. So they have this. They probably have this really unique problem-solving ability, and that's what makes the whole story so interesting. And so it does seem like you're really, really good at extracting that story. So to your point, but also to backtrack. So you said you were fired from almost every one of your jobs. So can you run through a few of those jobs? And do you think some of those jobs impacted where you are now? I'm sure they did.
There's no question. You know, when you get fired from a job, anybody who knows has had this happen to them is just like, this is the worst thing in the world. Like, life can't. You really are like, this is a low point, and it is. I mean, getting fired from a job. I mean, you know, that unfortunately the harsh reality of getting fired from a job is that, you know, when you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the very bottom of the pyramid just gets taken out from under you, you know, because like you need income, like there's no, and that's devastating. And I don't care where you are in your life, whether you're, you know, a kid out of college who gets fired from your first job, or whether you're, you know, in your 40s and have worked at the same place for your whole life and you have a family and kids to support. There's no questioning that, you know, that is one of the most devastating moments of your life when it happens. When it happens multiple times in a row, then you start to question, you know, the sanity of your own decisions. And you start to wonder, okay, maybe it isn't the job, maybe it's me. And maybe it's the decisions that I'm making, and maybe I'm not meant for this. So a couple of different places. One, I got fired from my first job out of college, which was at a software company that made software for medical transcription. And it was a total shit show of a place to work. I mean, the CEO fired 3 people every month. 3 weeks after I started, there was a 20% across the board pay cut, and everybody took the pay cut except the CEO and his wife and his brother, who all worked there. And you know, I mean, it was you could tell this thing was going to go nowhere. I mean, eventually the CEO was removed by the board like 3 years later. But you know, bit by bit, everybody there got fired. So it was kind of like, okay, this is a toxic working environment. Then I got laid off, but it was a very profitable layoff because I was at a company called LoudCloud that eventually was sold to HP for like billions of dollars by Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz. But I was there for 2 weeks, and they did this layoff, and the company policy was that no matter how long you've been here, you get 3 months of severance pay. So for my 2 weeks of doing absolutely nothing, I got 3 months of severance pay. And then a week later, I found another job at a place called Placeware, which sold web conferencing software, which now I think is Microsoft Live Meeting, because they got, you know, this is another goofy story in this whole thing that, you know, I don't think I've ever told. I think literally 3 weeks after I left, you know, the thing is that they hired like 70 salespeople all at once. So I got another like 15 or 20 grand from a draw. But I think 4 or 5 months into it, it was very clear that there was no way they could sustain this large of a sales force with this little of a territory. And I think the reality is that they brought in this CEO, and this CEO pretty much, I think, looked at it as, okay, let me bring in as many people as I can. Let me drum up the revenue as quickly as I can. And then they sold the company to Microsoft, which, of course, all the shareholders benefit tremendously. It doesn't matter how it turns out for the employees. And, you know, I left literally, I remember a month after I left, one of my friends was like, we're being acquired by Microsoft. I was like, you got to be kidding. There's a good chance I wouldn't have made the cut anyways, like, because even with the Microsoft acquisition, I believe there were still layoffs. And then, you know, I didn't actually get fired from this market research company that I worked at, but I left before I was about to be fired. Like you know, my first boss threw me under the bus on his way out the door when the new VP asked him, who should we get rid of? And then this new VP basically just seemed to have it out for me and didn't really, you know, I mean, there was he didn't really give me much of a chance. And so he basically was like, you're on a 3-week performance improvement plan. And I was like, go to hell. I didn't even try to improve. When he called 3 weeks later, he said, I wanted to see how things are going. I'm like, things are going so well that I'm resigning. So, you know, I'm like, I feel like you didn't really give me much of a shot. And that guy was a putz. Like, it was amusing to me that this guy who had spent 20 years of his life working at the same company told me that I didn't seem like somebody who was interested in controlling my own destiny. But here's the thing, right? Like, I was really pissed off when all of this happened. And, would I go out and buy these guys a drink or play around a golf with them? No, I'd probably club them over the head with a golf club if I had to spend a day with any of them. But I wouldn't be where I am if it wasn't for them. And I get to do something that I absolutely love and I'm good at. And in a large part, it's due to some of the choices they made. Like they all did. The only boss who really, I think, got it and told me in a way that made sense, and even when he told me it didn't make sense, was my boss at Intuit. He said, I would be doing a huge disservice if we made you a job offer. And so he said, you won't believe that. You don't believe that now, but you'll see in a few years. And he was right. He was spot on. I mean, to sit around, I remember joking and saying, I'm kind of glad I didn't get a job offer from TurboTax. I mean, I don't even enjoy paying taxes. Imagine working on this for a living.
Right. I can relate it. It sounds like you definitely were not somebody cut out for the corporate mold. And
Not at all.
I was never good at playing the game. That's for sure. So I think you mentioned your love for surfing a few minutes ago. So can you talk to us a little bit about when did you start to surf? When did you decide that? I know it's a big part of your life from what I've read and what I've listened to.
There's a greater theme here than just me surfing. It's another pattern that I've observed. In fact, I've been writing about it in my upcoming book. When I've looked at people who achieve like really big creative things, or even, entrepreneurial things, it seems like there's always something that fuels that endeavor in a big way. And often it happens to be a physical activity. Because I think that when you do something like surf or snowboard, which I also do, you finally start to understand what it means to feel flow. And, to think that there are people who go through their lives without ever experiencing flow, that just seems horrific to me now that I've had the thrill of experiencing it. I'm like, God, what an empty life to not experience how good it feels to experience flow. Like, you've missed out on something that really is a big part of what it means to be human. But the thing is that when you experience flow in one area of your life, it starts to translate into other areas of your life. So it sort of, flow amplifies ambition, not because of any of the external rewards that come from whatever it is you do, but because of the feeling itself. You're like, I will do whatever the hell I can in order to experience this on a regular basis. So, unfortunately, at least based on my sort of experience with it, and, I don't know that this is true across the board. I just finished reading a book called How Google Works. So I'd imagine this is one of the few places that is an exception to this. But for the most part, we haven't exactly designed working environments to be conducive to flow. People are basically just responding to email all day. People are doing work that doesn't really challenge them or reward them. It's very mind-numbing and repetitive, and so you put people in a situation where they can't produce flow, and then you wonder why they're bored out of their minds and they're not producing at the top of their game. I think that one of the things you start to realize is, okay, you need a constant challenge. I realize now why I didn't succeed in the environments I did is because, in all honesty, people put somebody like me in positions where, I think I was smarter than what I was, the job I was doing. Not that I'm some sort of genius, but I didn't go to Berkeley to sit around and respond to emails and make, customer support calls to people. I was just like, this is pointless. And again, I think timing also has played a big role in me getting to where I'm at. Like, if we'd started doing what we're doing today, I don't think we'd be where we're at. It's the landscape is so different. It's, what you're seeing with the sort of creation of media is proliferation of distribution channels and media assets like we've never seen before. So you have the 80s and the 90s in which you have the Oprah Winfrey effect, right? In which, you have this one person who has been picked and given sort of the blessing of the gatekeepers and is able to build this dominant presence. Even Oprah's own producers have basically said in the WBEZ podcast that they did called Making of Oprah, they said there will never be another Oprah Winfrey again. It's simply not possible because of the fact that the distribution of media is so different now. And you've got, instead of 500 channels, you have 500,000. And I think that's a quote unquote. If you've got 100,000 podcasts in iTunes, 1 million YouTube channels, and television, you're not going to see Oprah ever again. That's not going to be. It's just not. I mean, that's the reality of the world we live in. So it changes the entire sort of landscape of how media gets created and how audiences are built. So
to actually touch on the topic of flow again, this is a Conquer Your Inner Critic Summit, and when somebody's in the flow, they've conquered that inner critic. I mean, they're producing and doing something they like, and at a whole different level. So Jim Bunch, one of your interviewees, was talking about how environment, can help get you in that flow. So do you do anything at the Unmistakable office to help?
Yeah.
What's the environment like?
Yes, absolutely. You're gonna see this now. So I'm gonna turn this on. So this is my wall, what I call the Wall of Fame. Basically,
I love your artwork, by the way. Love it.
Thank you.
Who does it?
The goal was basically, okay, how do you create an environment that, basically where that came from, one of my friends, I said, if I were like, Howard Stern, I would have $1 million recording studio, and I'd have framed prints of my guests on the wall, like all of them. And she's like, what the hell is stopping you from doing that? And I was like, nothing, actually. So the idea was, design an environment that is conducive to the person you want to become. So, like this is my bedroom, and it's pretty much immaculate. Like I make my bed when I wake up in the morning. There's very little stuff on my desk. And so those are a few things just to keep, clutter out of the way and to keep the environment sort of hygienic, I guess, for creativity. I'm a person who doesn't function well with clutter. Like I need environments to be sort of, hygienic and immaculate in order to do my best work. The other thing I do is I block distractions every day. Like right now, there's a tool called Hey Focus, and I have everything blocked for the next 4 hours. So like for 4 hours, no email, no Facebook. Like I think extended periods of time in which you are disconnected from the world at large are really important. I leave my phone out of the room. Like even if I use an app called Focus at Will, which plays like, music that puts your brain
in writing these down,
focus state. And, so what I'll do is I'll start Focus at Will, and I'll set it to go for about 90 minutes because I've realized that 90 minutes is about the timeline in which you kind of, you go through. You can work for 90 minutes without for lack of something less crude, blowing your cognitive load. Because you reach an inevitable point of diminishing returns, and mine happens around 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So after that, I just hang out and I read and I do other stuff and administrative stuff. But like I try to do the most challenging and demanding creative work between 6 to 9 a.m. is writing time, 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. is interview time, and then that's it. Like I also make a point to shut devices off, at a certain point in the day, just for a few hours. Try to shut down from 6 to 8, like no phone calls, nothing. No, it's funny because people constantly talk about being distracted. And one of the easiest ways to not be distracted is just to turn everything off. The reason that this works is because when you turn things off, what you're doing is you're increasing what's called activation energy. Sean Acor wrote this amazing book called The Happiness Advantage, which really is a book that's all about productivity. It's not just a book about happiness. One of the best books you'll ever read. Like that book, I can honestly say, literally changed my life. Like I learned how to write 1,000 words a day because of that book. So you turn all these things off. You're like, oh, okay. Just the fact that you have to go through the effort of turning on your phone again means you'll be less likely to check it. So, turn it off, leave it out of the room. I play video games. Even I'm a weirdo who plays sports video games, and I couldn't tell you a damn thing about what's going on in any major sport. I did watch the Super Bowl this year, but other than that, it's funny. Like I like sports movies. Can't stand watching sports on TV. Like I think it's the most boring thing in the world. So that's
it's always a good plot. The underdog typically wins in the sports movies, and
yeah, exactly. Like you watch
a great job of building up that underdog. So,
remember the Titans and stuff like that. It's like, wow, football is so much more exciting in the movies than it is in an actual game. So yeah, those are things that to flow. But if you want to talk about inner critic, I'm happy to even address some of that as well.
Yeah, what I was going to bring up really is, as somebody now that has interviewed over 600 people, a lot of the people that you interview are really scientists that are somewhat experts at mind hacking and life hacking, and productivity hacking. Jim Bunch, and I mentioned before, Srini Rao, plenty of people.
Yeah.
So I'm going to ask you, what would be some of the most interesting and best mind hacks to help overcome that inner critic and be more productive and bust through those blocks to help you realize your goals?
Yeah. Some of the things I've just mentioned sort of are about, distraction being, first thing to do is eliminate distraction. Like you have to get rid of sources of distraction if you want to actually do anything productive or creative.
That's a big one, and the multitasking is so toxic for us, and yet people constantly do it. I mean, I'm guilty of it at moments. Like I'll be browsing the web on one thing and having a Slack chat with, business partners on the other. And it's like, this is disastrous. Like, actually perfect example. So presence is a big one. So last night I had a date for then I hadn't been on a date in a while. And I thought to myself, I'm like, let me turn off the phone. And just turning off the phone fundamentally changed the entire interaction. It was way more like, it was just a much richer and much more meaningful conversation. It was easier. Like when you're present, like the problem is when we have our phones on, there's always this constant sense that you want to be somewhere where you're not. Like being somewhere else as opposed to where you are is incredibly important. So that's a big one, is just eliminating source of distraction and not multitasking. The thing that's interesting is that a lot of people are constantly on the lookout for sort of mind hacks and brain hacks, and they spend so much time looking at, what my friend Chris Bailey calls productivity porn, that they're actually not productive. Like, the thing is, you're reading all this stuff about productivity, so it feels productive, but you're not actually doing anything. And that's, one of the sort of curses of the world we live in. I think that a big part so a couple of things that I think come to mind. I mean, you're a mindfulness practitioner, so meditation is one. I use the Calm app and I meditate every day for like 10 minutes, and I'm on an 18-day streak, which I'm kind of like, wow, this is pretty rad. I'll tell you what convinced me of the meditation habit, like to finally adopt it. And this is incredibly capitalistic and obnoxious, but I heard that Ray Dalio meditates, and I was like, Ray Dalio is a billionaire. I'm like, think I'm good. That seems like a good habit to adopt. Like, so another crazy thing I'm doing right now, which I may have mentioned on the show, is called the Billionaire Reading Project, where I'm trying to go through and read every book ever written about, or recommended by a billionaire. So I'm sure, that it'll take a while. And people have been asking me, what have you learned? I'm like, billionaires read really long fucking books. So, I think also the people that you surround yourself with are a big, big aspect of, what happens to your inner critic, right? Because the thing is, if the people that you surround yourself with are constantly negative, they're just reinforcing the voice of the inner critic. So, like when I was in college, I had a couple of friends who, like, you're hanging out with them, and anytime you were about to achieve something in your career, it was always, oh, this isn't going to work out, or this is negative. I mean, like the two most negative guys you could ever imagine. And after a while, I was like, I can't take this anymore. I don't want to hang out with people like this. Like, this is just toxic. And then I actually, and I've looked at it. I've looked at the caliber, the quality of the people in my life, and the things I've achieved in terms of significance externally. They're directly related. And I don't think that's not the case for anybody who's achieved anything. So the people that you surround yourself with have a big impact on your inner critic, because you don't want to be around people who are reinforcing the very thing that you feel self-doubt about. You want people who don't reinforce that. And so, my business partner, Brian, is, a perpetual optimist, and you need that. You need somebody who has the ability to be like, yeah, this is shit. This is terrible, but we're going to get through it because we're awesome. You need people who, here's another thing to think about is, Chris Sacca, venture capitalist, has a really sort of great saying that he talks about. And every time he's interviewed, he mentions this, and it stuck with me. He said, when he invests in founders, one of the things that every founder who has succeeded in common is that they believe in the inevitability of their success. And maybe, and sometimes the people you're around can really reinforce that belief. Like he said, they don't talk in conditional statements. So he said, he tells a story of meeting Kevin Systrom, who was, pivoting bourbon into Instagram. And Kevin Systrom was basically working with him and a buddy at a co-working space when Sacca came to see him. And I mean, they didn't have hardly any users at this time. And when he started explaining Instagram, he's like, he literally would say, when we get to 50 million users, we'll do this. When we get to 100 million users, we'll do this. So it was almost as if he just assumed that, so that's a big one.
There was no if we get there, it's when we get there.
When we get there, exactly. So that was, that always stayed with me. So I think that's a big one. And then the other one is literally just the work itself. Is putting, people always ask me, how do you overcome resistance or writer's block? I'm like, very easily. You sit down and you write. Like you get, you open a blank page and you just start typing, and words show up on the page. Not that the words are any good, but that doesn't matter. Like, you have to be okay with the quality of what you're creating sucking for a long enough time that you get good at it. Ira Glass has this thing about taste. It's a great video. You should look it up. I don't remember what it's called, but he talks about this as well. Like there's a point at which you have a taste for what you want to create, but you don't have the skill to do it. And that skill comes from time and effort and deliberate practice and all the things that nobody wants to do because, they're not things that happen overnight. Like this is, I mean, you and I are talking about something that is probably 9 years in the making. Like now that I look at it, it makes me feel tired when I say it.
Well, it's amazing. You've gotten 600 interviews and going strong. So do you have anything you're working on new right now that you
I'm
working on plug and talk about?
On a second book that's all about creative habits and how do you sustain, creativity and productivity for extended periods of time in a world that is incredibly distracted. Like, the idea is how are we creative? How do you stay creative in an increasingly digital world where, it's very easy to fall out of sort of this balance with consumption and creation, because consumption can make you feel as if you're doing something. You can listen to 100 podcasts, read 100 newsletters, read 50 articles on Medium, and you can say, I had a really productive day. It's like, no, I didn't do shit today, actually. Like you may have read a lot and listened to a lot, but you really did nothing because you didn't create anything. And I think that often people will do that kind of stuff because of the fact that creative work is actually hard and demanding, and it's not as easy. It doesn't give you the sort of instant gratification. Like you have to work, you have to suffer through, parts of it that are painful, and that's just the reality of it. Like I'm learning, the first time I wrote a book, it was kind of like, this is a breeze. I'm like a rock star. I can write books. And the second time I'm like, holy shit, what has happened? I'm nowhere near the writer that I once was, and I'm realizing that it's hard work. Like you're constantly challenging yourself. You're being challenged by the people around you. And the other thing is, once a standard is set, everything kind of is determined by that standard. Like you're like, okay, we can't produce anything below this standard, and so like I've scrapped interviews in the middle of them. I've, not published interviews despite probably pissing off some people. That's that, my commitment has always been, my commitment has always been to the product and to our listeners. It's like, I'm reading this book about the founders of Home Depot right now as part of my billionaire reading project. But they said their focus has always been on customers, right? Not competition. And our focus has always been, it's not about the guest. It's not about, just numbers. I mean, numbers are important, but more than anything, it's about, is somebody listening to this going to be like, wow, that was a good use of my time? Because, attention is this very, very valuable currency in the world that we live in, and people have it in short supply.
Especially with these things these days,
So, yeah.
So, Srini, I want to really thank you so much for your time. It's been, I think, a treasure trove of information for me and for my listeners. And again, I want to plug the Unmistakable Creative podcast or interview series. I know you don't like to use the term podcast, but just thanks again. And I really look forward to following all your future projects and reading your upcoming book as well.
Awesome. Well, I'm happy to help. Thank you so much.
Thank you.